for centuries, to a greater or lesser degree, there has been a constant tension within the West and within Christendom specifically regarding the issue of integration or separation with the world around that is either actually or perceived as hostile. How should we deal with that when looking to build a new system, or maybe rebuild a system that was for a modern world? Welcome to the Halcyon Project. Let's get into it. Over the past several centuries, especially since the Protestant Reformation, this question has been approached and handled differently based on time and sect. You have the entire spectrum from the radical Anabaptist, Amish, Mennonite, Hutterite types that go for complete segregation from the world, ranging all the way up to including the modern mainline Protestant denominations that not only embrace the secular world around them, but in a lot of cases push the secular envelope. Maybe the less said about the specifics, the better, given the platform we're on. So what is the right mean? Or is the mean the right way to approach this? On the integration front, I think learning from the early church and the early Christians that basically spawned Western civilization out of the Roman Empire, the first thing that has to be addressed is which direction a community faces. So in the case of the radical Anabaptists cloistering themselves away in communes and shut communities, there's no outward-facing mission. Even if there is one that's given a lip service, there's functionally no outward-facing mission. And that's a problem, because Christianity in the West didn't grow by looking inwards. The entire history of both Christendom and the West, until very recently, has been one of outward expansion. And this stems in large part from Jesus telling his disciples to occupy until he arrives. Very military language, in fact. So there has been this outward push to Christianize and civilize the world that the Anabaptist types reject, turn inward, and attempt to sequester themselves from worldly influence. The impulse in and of itself isn't problematic. We do want to make sure that we are that beacon on a hill set apart, but not at the expense of turning away so far from the world that we become untouchable. The early Christians defined themselves in Rome by finding babies discarded outside the city that were unwanted, taking them in and raising them. They didn't hide from the social issues of their day. They confronted them head on, which was both peculiar to them and dangerous for them. So we need to be outward facing without crossing the line into accepting secular influence where it is undue and destructive. That's not to say that a properly functioning culture or civilization or community within one shouldn't innovate and shouldn't change with the times. They certainly should, but there needs to be a fine balance struck between outward-facing mission and inward-facing purity. Though having said that, that service orientation needs to be first and foremost. The definition of Christendom, certainly for the first several centuries, was one of service to unbelievers, especially in Rome, which paradoxically led to persecution. And if you've read the news, that's probably coming back if you're going to live the way that you're supposed to. So whether that's feeding the poor, or donating to charities, or working with community organizations to help underprivileged youth, what that means specifically, I think, is up to some interpretation. But if one is to try and build a Christian enclave or a Christian borough, something that is somewhat self-sustaining, it does need to remain outward-facing, both because we're commanded to be in service to those around us, and also because when things become too cloistered and too close and too inward facing, things become culty and very legalistic very quickly. I speak from some personal experience in that regard. The other thing to consider is that the church, capital C, basically functions as a spiritual immune system to the body of a civilization that is the state, as far as I can tell. And so when that immune system is working properly, infections like radical liberalism never take hold because they are snuffed out before they gain ground. Unfortunately, we're at a point where the body has cancer and the immune system has been severely compromised. So it's my belief that any experiment in Christian boroughs or Christian enclaves, one of the primary functions of an experiment such as that will be perhaps not on a national or a global level, but on a local scale, even on a personal level between acquaintances, to shift the Overton window. And I hesitate to say to the right because I don't want to use that language, but to shift the Overton window. For those who aren't aware, the Overton window is a concept in psychology that basically defines what is culturally acceptable to do and to say. So the Overton window has a range of acceptable, for our purposes, let's call it opinion, that a member of a society can hold and be in good standing with that society. The trouble is, over the last nearly century, maybe more than a century, depending where you start counting, the Overton window in Western countries has been, in my estimation, purposefully and mindfully shifted further and further to the materialist secular side of the spectrum. So where a few short decades ago it was completely acceptable to have a negative view of certain perversions that have become legalized, accepted, and in some cases protected in the West, was completely acceptable and in most cases the norm rather than the exception. By contrast, today, if you question certain protected groups of a certain perverse persuasion, in some countries you can see prison time for it. That is an example of the Overton window shifting from a more culturally conservative, mind you, not politically conservative, culturally conservative frame to a more secular, materialist, progressivist viewpoint. To build something of any substance and meaning, I believe it will be incumbent on anybody undertaking such an endeavor to purposefully attempt to shift that Overton window back to where it came from, and in a lot of cases further back into cultural conservatism than it has been in anybody's lifetime that might be listening to this. We've been on a decline of secularism, materialism, and decadence for at least a century, and that needs to move back the other direction quite radically, something that won't happen quickly, but it does need to happen, and it won't happen without purposeful intent on the part of people who know better. As an extension of that, a reclaiming of our cultural inheritance on a societal level goes hand in hand with the shifting of this Overton window, and actually ties in with this integration with society for its better. The West is the heir of great minds like Bach and Beethoven and Michelangelo and Raphael, to say nothing of the great warriors that built and defended the West, whether it be the Crusader Knights, the Teutonic Knights, the Hospitallers, even up to and including some modern warriors in more recent conflicts that I won't get into here. But even that martial culture that was inculcated actually through New Testament teaching, in spite of what limp-wristed modern congregations might have you believe today, to say nothing of the arts and the music and the architecture of our forefathers that has been destroyed, spat on, covered up, obfuscated, called every name in the book, and degraded to the point that most of us listening, I would hazard to guess, don't even know about most of it. And it's a cultural heritage that has nothing to be ashamed of and needs to be reclaimed, not just within the circles of the audience that might be listening to something like this, but it has to be reestablished even in the secular culture if we are to move that Overton window and swing that pendulum back to something much more sane. Because without roots, a people doesn't know where it came from, and it can't know where it's going. Those roots are still there. We've just been disconnected from them, and we need to take those roots back and start educating the people around us about them. It's very sad to me the state of things like modern architecture, modern music, and modern visual art, which are completely decadent and perfectly degenerate, when we come from a tradition that sees the most transcendent art, architecture, and music the world has ever seen. Fight me on it. And so that has to be reestablished, not just within your circle, but in the circles that you touch. People need to be reminded of this and reminded of the greatness of their forefathers and reminded to stop being ashamed about it, because there's nothing to be ashamed about. Having said all that, that's the integration front when talking about setting up a Christian enclave or a Christian borough. The separation aspect, which is the flip side of the coin or the other wing of the bird, also needs to be considered. And this is where things can get sticky, because you do need to set up some sense of separation between you, your people, and a culture that is hostile to you to a greater or lesser degree, depending on context, granted. But the culture at large right now, being so secular, materialist, and hyper-liberal, is definitely opposed and combative towards the traditional and classical principles of Christendom and the West. But it's important not to go too far down that line and end up in a cloistered community. But having said that, any project that seeks to reintegrate the lessons of the past and set up a Christian civilization, or pocket civilization, enclave if you like, must be first and foremost a haven for children and a haven to have children. Because the only way we win this fight is through reproduction, effectively. Because it's one thing to free your mind from the shackles of modernism, but if you don't pass it on, it doesn't do any good. And so, first and foremost, children have to be at the pinnacle of this protection hierarchy. As part of that, you do have to maintain, in the face of outward community-focused orientation and service, you do have to maintain an internal solidarity and exclusivity. I think the Old Testament temple is a good example of this. The temple was three-tiered. It had the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies. Almost anybody could come into the outer court. After purification, many people could come into the inner court, but only the priest class could enter the Holy of Holies. And so what we're talking about here is that Holy of Holies, that inner core that can't be compromised by the filth of the outside, while still servicing those two outer courts. And maybe another way to think about this is in military terms, where you have your general infantry, and then you have special forces. The general infantry is necessary, but the special forces are really what can move the needle and actually prepare the way for that general infantry in a lot of cases, operating behind enemy lines without support, in a lot of cases in a way that's deniable, where that general military force won't even acknowledge that they exist. That's really what we're talking about here. We have been in the West, as Christendom, basically in a position of retreat for 200 years, 300 years, depending where you want to start counting. And so we are now in enemy-occupied territory. Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case, but through the neglect and cowardice of strong conservative men, I'll lay it at the feet of them primarily, present company included, we've been in a state of retreat for centuries. And now, in order to reestablish any kind of normalcy that was standard for a couple of millennium in the West, now we have to fight our way back to a sense of normalcy, history, and rootedness. So you do have to keep a certain degree of inclusivity. Maybe a good way to say it is you need a narrow front door and a big back door to make sure that you only let in people that fit the mission. And that when you have people that get in who don't fit the mission, you ask them kindly to leave. Not that you wish them ill, but if they're not pulling in the same direction, we shouldn't be wasting resources on pandering to them. If they're offended by what we're doing, they know where the door is. Having said that, we're not cutting people off and isolating ourselves, but we do need a central core of people that are committed to a mission and won't apologize for it. And so you have to have a solid center of faith and tradition. Now, what that looks like is a topic that's a little bit too broad for this particular chat, and maybe even this particular format. But certainly, it's something to start thinking about. This very modernist idea of the hyper evangelical hold hands and sing kumbaya Christianity really doesn't work in this context because it's too big tent. The defining characteristic of most evangelical congregations today is that they don't want to offend because they want to bring everybody in. What I'm suggesting is you want to serve everybody, but you don't let just anybody into your inner circle. Because if you let anybody in, you can't make any strong stand for anything because you risk offending people. Most of those people that I'm referring to in this context are the type that are more or less with the modern liberalist secular program, even if they identify as Christian. And I would venture to say that a lot of people that would call themselves conservative actually don't even realize just how much ground they have ceded to modern liberal secularism. And that's in some ways not their fault because they've been very much indoctrinated that way through school, through media, through news. But we do need to sequester ourselves from being influenced by pandering to those people's sensibilities. That's not to say we don't want them to come in, but we want them to come in on our terms. Again, what exactly that looks like is probably beyond the scope here, but going back to a more traditional worship style might be part of it. Re-embracing traditional arts is almost definitely part of it. Not a legalistic rejection of anything that comes out of the modern world, because we do need to adapt and keep ourselves up with the times, for lack of a better term, but without diluting our central core. And that's maybe something we'll get into at some later point. So I think the takeaway here, the crux of the issue, if you will, is that if you or I or anybody else is to embark on a project of setting up an enclave civilization or a Christian borough, I think the mantra that needs to be kept in mind here is that we need to keep a clean heart with dirty hands. We need to be involved in the world around us, but we need to have a sanctuary and a sanctum to retreat to where the world, the hostility of the world does not impact. And so you don't bring the negativity and the combativeness of the world into that sanctuary. And so maybe I'll leave it there for this chat, and I'd love to hear what anybody thinks in the comments below. If you've got anything to add, or if you have thoughts on how to implement a system like that, please share them below and we can get a conversation started. You've been listening to the Halcyon Project. Thanks for tuning in.